Ah, hello, dear friends, and welcome to this second part on Greek myths and legends. This book is a lovely illustrated book, an Usborne illustrated guide, and in today's part we will be starting off with evil men. So we have Daedalus, an inventor, who designed the maze for the Minotaur on Crete, and offended King Minos, who imprisoned him and his son Icarus, but he planned an ingenious escape by both making wings for them out of feathers, wax and thread. So they flew from the prison, and Icarus was so thrilled at flying like a bird, despite his father's warnings, he flew higher and higher until he was so close to the sun that the wax melted and broke the wings apart, fell into the sea and drowned near the island now called Icaria after him. I mean, I don't quite know how that makes you an evil man. He's just simply trying to get out of a prison and warned his son against that, but he didn't listen. Ixion was a murderer. Here we go. That's a little bit more evil. He killed his future father-in-law generously. Zeus was prepared to forgive him, but instead of being grateful, Ixion planned to carry off Zeus's wife, Hera. Zeus couldn't believe he would really be that wicked, so he made a double of his wife out of clouds to see what would happen. To his dismay, Ixion pounced and carried the cloud woman Ophelia away, proving how evil he was. As punishment, Zeus ordered Hermes to tie Ixion to a wheel of fire, which he set rolling endlessly around the sky. Sounds quite fun, as a punishment. Phaeton was the son of the Titan Helios. Apollo was god of the sun, but Helios was responsible for driving it across the sky in his chariot. Phaethon longed to have a go at the reins, and he begged so hard that at last his father agreed to let him try. At first he drove it well, but then he began to show off. He rode so high that the earth froze and came so low that it scorched. Zeus was appalled and threw a thunderbolt at Phaethon, who fell from the chariot and was killed. Sisyphus was the most unpleasant. He seduced his niece, took his brother's throne, and betrayed Zeus's secrets, and Zeus ordered Pluto to take him to Hades. Sisyphus slyly asked Pluto to try on his chains to show how they worked, and then quickly secured them and took Pluto prisoner, which caused havoc as the dead couldn't enter Hades without Pluto as guide. Ares rescued Pluto, and Sisyphus went to Tartarus. He was sent to Tartarus, where he was made to roll a boulder up a steep hill. When he reached the top, the stone rolled back down and tried again and again, but each time it was the same, so he couldn't finish his task. That's whenever you hear that something's a Sisyphean task, it's impossible. You can't ever complete it. Midas, to thank King Midas for looking after Silenus, Dionysus granted him a wish, but the greedy king asked that everything he touched turn to gold. He regretted it when even his daughter became a gold statue and food turned to gold when he tried to eat. He pleaded with Dionysus to undo the wish, which he did. But then Midas offended Apollo, who gave him an ass's ears, and he hid the shameful ears under his cap, but his barber discovered them. The barber was sworn to secrecy, but longed to tell someone. He dug a hole, spoke the secret into it, then filled it in, hoping it was safely buried. But some reeds grew on the spot, and when they rustled in the wind, they whispered what was in the earth below, and everyone knew how silly Midas was. Maybe somebody should try that and bury a secret into the ground and see what grows from it, whispers the secrets in the wind. Tantalus was Zeus's friend and dined with the gods. He abused this honour by stealing ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, and giving it to his friends on earth. He then invited the gods to a banquet and decided to test for himself whether they really were all-knowing. He killed and served up his own son Pelops at the feast, knowing it was forbidden to eat the human flesh. The gods knew at once what was on their plates, and Zeus was so angry that he banished Tantalus to Tartarus. He was made to stand in a pool of water with fruit hanging just out of his reach. If he tried to eat or drink, the fruit and water moved away, so he was eternally tormented by hunger and thirst. What an evil man. Here we have fate and the three heroes. So, ancient Greeks believed in fate, which meant their lives were predetermined by the gods. We have Bellerophon, who was the grandson of Sisyphus, and wrongly accused of trying to seduce the wife of King Proteus of Argos. And angrily, Proteus sent Bellerophon, that's a tricky name to say, Bellerophon from his court, with a letter to deliver his hospitality. But the Chimera was a fire-breathing monster with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and a serpent's tail, so the king was sure he would fail and be killed. However, Athene decided to help Bellerophon. She lent him her winged horse Pegasus, and he flew over the Chimera and plunged his spear down its throat. He then helped the king by flying above his enemies and pelting them with rocks. The king could not believe the hero deserved to die after this, and they became friends, and he even married his daughter. But after a while he became too proud, tried to fly to Olympus on Pegasus, and no human was allowed in the home of the gods without an invitation, so he had to be punished. Zeus sent a fly that drove Pegasus wild, and the hero was thrown from his back and landed in a thorn bush. He was blinded and lamed, ending his life homeless and alone. Oh dear. Orion was Poseidon's son. Of course, we know Orion's belt in the star system. He was a great hunter and a very handsome man, but offended several of the immortals. The goddess Eos was in love with him, but he abandoned her to hunt with Artemis, and Apollo was on guard in case Orion insulted or hurt his sister. Orion then angered Mother Earth by boasting that he could kill all of the wild animals and monsters in the world, which were of course her children. So she sent a giant scorpion to attack Orion. He fought bravely, but soon realised it couldn't be killed by mortal weapons, so he dived into the sea to escape, hoping to reach the island of Delos, where Eos would protect him. It was Artemis waiting for him, though. Apollo joined her and bet that she could not hit the small shape bobbing out at sea with her arrow. Apollo knew very well that this was Orion, but Artemis accepted his challenge, shot accurately, and killed him. When she realised what she had done, she begged Asclepius to bring Orion back to life, but he was forbidden to do so by Zeus, so Artemis put the image of Orion amongst the stars, where he is forever chased across the sky by the scorpion, the star sign Scorpio. There you have it, a little bit of history behind those two star systems in our night sky. Of course, your fate was unavoidable, but it could seem very unfair in the case of Oedipus, son of King Laius and the Queen Jocasta of Thebes. An oracle said that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother, so Laius exposed him on a mountain to die, so it couldn't come true. But a shepherd found the baby and took him to Corinth, where the king and queen adopted him. He believed these were his real parents, and when he heard the prophecy, he ran away, hoping to avoid his fate. On the road, Oedipus quarrelled with a man he met. Neither would step out of the other's way. There was a fight, and Oedipus killed him. He didn't know it, but it was Laius, so that part of the prophecy came true. And then near Thebes, Oedipus met the Sphinx, a beast with a woman's head, lion's body, serpent's tail, and eagle's wings. She asked passers-by a riddle. What goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening, and is weakest when it has most legs? She killed anyone who couldn't answer, and no one had ever escaped until Oedipus answered correctly. The Sphinx flung herself off a cliff in humiliation. It would be nice if it told us what the answer to the riddle would be, wouldn't it? That's going to drive us mad. The Thebans were delighted and made Oedipus king, as Laius was dead, and then he married the dead king's wife Jocasta, and so unknowingly fulfilled the other half of the prophecy. Here we have some love stories. Echo and Narcissus. The nymph Echo distracted Hera while Zeus chased mountain nymphs. That old dog. As punishment, Hera condemned her nether to make a comment of her own again, so she could only repeat the last words that other people said. That's why it's called an echo. I love all these connections. Poor Echo fell in love with Narcissus, who was handsome, but also hard-hearted and vain. She followed him, helplessly repeating the ends of his phrases until she faded away with sorrow, leaving only her voice. And Narcissus made many other lovers unhappy, until Artemis decided to punish him. She showed him his own reflection in a pool, and he fell in love with it, and realizing he would never love anyone else as well, he stabbed himself to death in despair. The flower called Narcissus sprang up from his blood. Of course, we have the very famous tale of Orpheus and Eurydice here. Orpheus was the best musician in Greece when he returned from his travels with Jason, and he married his beloved Eurydice, but soon after she died of a snake bite. Orpheus went to the underworld to beg Pluto to free her. He played such sweet music on his lyre that Pluto was charmed and agreed to let Eurydice go if Orpheus could lead her from his kingdom without looking back. set off and Eurydice followed, but the temptation to turn round was too great. He looked too soon and lost her for good. Orpheus was so unhappy that he forgot to make sacrifices to Dionysus and the Maenads to tore him apart, and he was buried at the foot of Mount Olympus, and birds were said to sing more sweetly there than anywhere else. Orpheus joined Eurydice in Hades, and his lyre became the group of stars called Lyra. A very tragic tale. And here we have a very heroic tale of Jason and the Golden Fleece, because Jason was heir to the throne of Iolcus, but his uncle Peleus stole the crown when Jason was a baby. The deposed king and his son were banished, but when Jason grew up, he came to claim his crown. Peleus said that Jason could be his heir if he fetched the Golden Fleece from Colchis, that fleece that came from the ram that Hera had sent to rescue Phrixus. I think I mentioned that in the first part. And of course Peleus hoped that he wouldn't return. So Jason had a great ship built and gathered a crew of heroes to accompany him. The ship was called Argo, and its crew, the Argonauts. King Phineus's advice was that he agreed to help if they could rid him of the harpies, and they were birds with a woman's head that screeched and snatched food so their victims couldn't eat or rest. The heroes attacked the birds, who clawed and slashed but were driven out to sea at last. Phineus knew how to get past the clashing rocks, which formed a lethal barrier at the entrance to the Straits of Bosphorus. So they were crashed shut if a ship tried to pass between them. So send a bird through first to make the rocks crash shut, and as they reopen, row between quickly before they shut again. And they got through safely. At Colchis, Jason told King Aeetes their mission. He didn't intend to let Jason take the fleece, so he said to prove himself, he had to harness 2 fire-breathing bulls, plough a field with them, and plant some dragon's teeth. He was sure Jason would be killed, but the gods made his daughter, the witch Medea, fall in love with Jason and help him. And Medea gave him a potion to protect him from bull's breath while he ploughed, and when he planted the dragon's teeth, armed soldiers sprang up and attacked. He took Medea's advice and threw a stone among them, and one soldier thought another had hit him. Fighting broke out, and they all killed each other. Medea then told Jason how to deal with the dragon serpent guarding the fleece. Had a dragon's head and serpent's body and was known never to sleep, so on Medea's advice, Jason asked Orpheus to play a lullaby on his lyre until the beast closed its eyes. He grabbed the fleece, ran back to Argo, taking Medea and her half-brother with him, and swore to marry Medea and be faithful. On the way back, King Aeetes chased them and was catching up, so cool Medea killed her half-brother. She threw his limbs overboard, knowing her father would stop to pick them up and stop the chase. That's very harsh. Some say they crossed Europe by river, emerging in the north and sailing past Britain, France and Spain on their way home. They met more dangers, such as the sirens on Capri, who tried to drown them in the rocks, but Orpheus played his lyre to drown their voices out. Well done, Orpheus. They were attacked by King Minos' bronze giant Telos, approaching Crete, and hurled rocks at strangers who came too near. The heroes distracted him while Medea removed the pin which kept his life force in, and then Talos then collapsed. But back in Iolcus, Medea tricked Peleus' daughters into killing him. She said they could restore his youth by boiling him in a cauldron. The throne was then free for Jason, but the people were sickened by Medea's deeds and banished them both. She was the heiress to the throne of Corinth, so they made their way there and Jason became king. He ruled well, but grew arrogant and broke his oath to Medea by planning to marry a princess Glaucus. Medea sent her a magic robe and crown as gifts, but when she put them on, they burst into flames and killed her. Medea fled, and some say she killed her children first, others that the Corinthians slew them in revenge. Jason eventually lost the god's favour and ended his life an outcast, and he roamed until he came across the rotting hull of the Argo. Here he sat down and was dreaming of the past when the prow fell and killed him. His death was a warning to anyone who broke his oath. It sounds quite video gamey, doesn't it? Jason's quest. I need your help to do this, but to do this you need to complete this task for me. There's lots of fetch quests. The original fetch quest. Of course we have Theseus, a popular Greek hero, where he fought the Minotaur. So quite a lot is known about Crete at the time when this adventure is supposed to have taken place. And the archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans arrived in Crete and began excavating, and his workmen started to dig out the ruins of Knossos, the palace of King Minos in 1900, and actually much remained of it. and many works of art were recovered, so it's easy to imagine that the size and complexity of the palace gave rise to the idea of the maze or a labyrinth at Knossos where the Minotaur was imprisoned in the story. And the Mediterranean, of course, has always suffered from earthquakes, and the Minoans of ancient Crete may have been trying to explain these disturbances, so they invented the story of a bull monster that lived below the island, and stamping and bellowing makes the ground tremble. So Theseus was brought up by his mother, and no one was sure who his father was, as both Poseidon and King Aegeus of Athens had loved his mother. She hoped that Aegeus would make the boy a successor. But Aegeus' wife was the witch Medea, who had been previously married to Jason. So when Theseus grew up and came to court, Medea recognised him through her magic powers and didn't want the king to discover his identity, since she wanted her own son by Aegeus to be the only heir to the throne. So Medea persuaded Aegeus that Theseus was a dangerous enemy and prepared a cup of poison which she gave him. As he was about to drink it, the king recognised the sword Theseus was wearing. He had given it to Theseus' mother as a gift for their son if they should have one. Theseus was welcome and declared successor, and Medea escaped in her serpent-drawn chariot. Her evil plans had failed again. Sounds a bit like very much like a Disney character, doesn't she? Years before, King Minos' son had been killed in Athens. In compensation, Minos demanded that 14 young Athenians should be sent to Crete every 9 years to be fed to the Minotaur. And the Minotaur was a dreadful beast with the head and shoulders of a bull and the body of a man, fed on flesh, and was kept in a maze called the Labyrinth, which had been designed by the craftsman Daedalus. No one who entered the maze ever came out alive. So when it came for the next victims to go, Theseus said he would go and try and kill the Minotaur. So the king was afraid for his son, could hardly bear waiting for the news, and asked the sailors who took Theseus to Crete to hoist white sails when they returned if all was well, and Theseus was alive. Minos recognised Theseus among the Athenians and taunted him about who his father was, so he dared to prove he was the son of Poseidon by retrieving a ring that he threw into the sea. Theseus died after it, prayed to Poseidon for help, and the Nereids found the ring for him, and Amphitrite was presented him with the crown worn by Thetis on her wedding day, so he emerged triumphant with the ring and the crown. Ariadne fell in love with Theseus when she saw him among the victims and offered to help him kill the Minotaur if he would marry her, and he agreed. That's quite a familiar theme as well, isn't it? Trials and challenges being assisted by the daughter of an antagonist. She gave him a magic ball of twine, tied one end to the entrance of the maze, and followed it as it unwound and led him into the centre of the labyrinth where the Minotaur lurked. There was a fight, but Theseus overcame the Minotaur and followed the path out with the magic twine, leading the other young Athenians who had been saved from their fate. They escaped by boat, took Ariadne with them. On the journey home they stopped at Naxos, and while Ariadne was sleeping, the ungrateful Theseus sailed off without her, forgetting that he owed his success to her and had promised to marry her. Terrible men in these stories, you know. When she woke up alone, realised she'd been abandoned, she cried to the gods for revenge, and the god Dionysus happened to be passing Naxos soon after, saw Ariadne and fell in love with her. She became his wife, and he soon granted her revenge by making Theseus so glad to be going home that he forgot to give the order to raise white sails, and approached Athens with black ones. So when Aegeus saw them, he believed his son must be dead and jumped into the sea and drowned himself in despair. So the sea where that happened was called the Aegean after him. Eventually he became king of Athens in his father's place, married Hippolyte, the Amazon queen, and later died fighting at Theseus' side in battle. Their son Hippolytus was killed through the wickedness of Theseus' jealous second wife Phaedra. After these tragic deaths, he became careless of his kingly duties and went adventuring again, kidnapped the young Helen of Troy, whose brothers had to raid Athens to rescue her, went to Tartarus with his friend Pirithous, who planned to snatch Persephone. They were caught by the gods and put in chains of forgetfulness. Theseus was later rescued by Heracles, but while he was away, his throne was taken for him. He eventually settled on the island of Skyros and died there, but his love for Athens outlasted his death, and when the city was about to lose the Battle of Marathon, his ghost appeared to inspire the troops and lead them to victory. After that, his body was brought home and buried with honours in Athens. And of course we have Heracles here, Hercules of old, one of the Greeks' favourite heroes. Hercules was the Roman name, Heracles the Greek. And when Heracles was a baby, Hera sent 2 deadly serpents to his cradle to kill him. He strangled them both, surprising everyone with his strength. famous for his great courage, Hera was so jealous of his happiness, drove him mad so that he killed his wife and children. When he recovered and saw what had happened, he was horrified and asked the oracle how he could make amends. He was told to offer himself as a slave to King Eurystheus. The king set Heracles 12 impossible tasks. If he could do them all, he would get rid of his guilt and become an immortal, and they were the 12 labours. The first being to kill the Nemean lion, with a hide so tough that no weapon could pierce it, so Heracles had to strangle it with his bare hands, and then wore the lion skin as protection. And then had to destroy the Lenaean Hydra in the swamps of Lerna. It had a dog-like body and 9 serpent heads, which grew again each time they were cut off, so he had to strike off each head and seal the neck with a burning torch before he could kill it. He had to capture the Ceryneian hind alive, which had hooves of bronze, horns of gold, and was sacred to Artemis. Catching it alive was more difficult than killing it, but he stalked it for a whole year before being able to catch it in a net. He trapped the Erymanthian boar, drove the enormous fierce creature into a deep snowdrift, and when it was captured he tied it with chains. He had to clean the Augean stables, which hadn't been cleaned for years and were piled high with dung. Heracles was told to clean them thoroughly in one day, which he couldn't even have done by himself, but succeeded because he diverted the course of a nearby river so that it swept through the stables and washed all the muck away. He then had to get rid of the Stymphalian birds, which were man-eating birds with bronze beaks, claws and wings. Heracles startled them with a great shout, so they flew up and he shot them with their arrows. To capture the Cretan bull, which was the father of the Minotaur, it ran wild on Crete, causing great damage, so Heracles managed to master the animal and take it back to Eurystheus by boat. He then had to round up the mares of Diomedes, which were horses that fed on human flesh and were extremely wild. Their master was called Diomedes. Heracles killed Diomedes first and fed him to the mares, and when they got full they were relatively calm and he got them under control. He then had to fetch Hippolyte's girdle or belt, who was the queen of the Amazons. She was quite happy to give Heracles her girdle, but Hera made the Amazonians think that he was hurting her, so they attacked and he had to fight their whole army to get the belt. His 10th trial was to fetch the cattle of Geryon, the cattle that lived on an island in the far west, guarded by Orthrus, a 2-headed dog, and the herdsman Geryon, who had 3 bodies above the waist. Heracles killed them both and drove the cattle home, and on his way west he placed 2 pillars, one in Spain and one in Morocco, to guard the Mediterranean. His penultimate trial was to fetch the golden apples of the Hesperides, the golden apples that belonged to Hera. They were kept by the Hesperides, who were the daughters of the Titan Atlas. Heracles didn't know where the Hesperides kept the apples, so he went to ask their father. Atlas had to support the weight of the heavens on his shoulders, but he said if Heracles could take his place for a while, he would go and fetch the apples. Heracles agreed and sent Atlas off. Atlas did return with the apples, but enjoyed his freedom so much that he refused to take his burden back. He said he would take the apples to Eurystheus himself. Heracles had to think quickly. He pretended to be willing to swap places with Atlas, but asked the Titan to take the weight for a moment so that he could settle it more comfortably. Atlas did so, and Heracles made his escape. Guard him. Lastly, he had to bring Cerberus from Tartarus, who was the monstrous 3-headed dog who guarded the gates of the underworld and prevented anyone leaving the land of the dead. Pluto gave Heracles permission to take Cerberus as long as he didn't use any weapons. The hero had to drag the struggling animal all the way to the court of Eurystheus. He had loads of other adventures. He killed the eagle that tormented Prometheus and set him free. He sailed with the Argonauts and also freed Theseus from his chains. He still suffered fits of madness sent by Hera until he was finally cured by the witch Medea, so she did do something nice there. His death came later when he married Daenerys, and they had several children, but Hera finally caused his death. She tricked Daenerys into giving Hercules a magic robe, told her the magic would keep him faithful to her, but in fact it was poisoned. The show caused agony. Whenever he put it on, he couldn't remove it. He had a funeral pyre built and climbed on it to die and escape the pain. Zeus snatched his son from the fire and took him to Mount Olympus, where he became an immortal. It's all ended happily for him there. Then, of course, we're on to the Trojan War. The real Troy, according to Homer, stood in a commanding position overlooking the Hellespont. So, at the end of the 19th century, a German businessman called Heinrich Schliemann, who passionately believed that Homer's poem was a true account of an actual event, set out to prove that Troy had actually existed. He explored the area in 1870, found the ruins of several cities, one on top of the other, just where Homer had said. Experts disagree about which layer of ruins might be Homer's Troy, but it seems clear that it was a real place, just there in the north of modern Turkey. It all kicked off because of the love story of Paris and Helen. Paris was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. At his birth, it was predicted that he could cause the downfall of Troy, so he was left to die on a hill, saved by a she-bear who fed him her milk until he was found by a herdsman who cared for him. The story starts at the wedding of Theseus and Peleus. It tells of how Eris, the goddess of spite, took her revenge for not being invited. Eris arrived during the feast with an apple inscribed "for the fairest." Very fairy tale. Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite all reached for it. Zeus did not want to choose between them, imagining the fury of the two not chosen, so decided someone else must judge and picked Paris. Paris was guarding his foster father's sheep when Hermes arrived with the goddesses and asked Paris to choose the loveliest. Each goddess tried to bribe Paris, Hera with power and wealth, Athene with great victories and wisdom, but Aphrodite just smiled and promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world if he chose her. Paris couldn't resist, of course he couldn't, and gave her the apple, earning the hatred of Hera and Athene. Aphrodite said the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, and that she lived in Greece at the court of Menelaus of Sparta. She did not say that Helen was Menelaus' wife. Paris returned to Troy, and soon after he competed in some games and won more prizes than any Trojan prince. Afraid that someone might harm him out of jealousy, his foster father revealed who he really was, and the Trojans welcomed him, forgetting the prophecy. Helen of Troy's parents were Zeus and Leda, and all the Greek princes wanted to marry her. Her foster father, Tyndareus, cleverly made all the suitors swear to support the man picked as her husband, then chose Menelaus. Earlier, the Greeks had kidnapped Princess Heracles of Troy, Priam's sister. Priam sent Paris and some men to arrange her release, and agreed that if the Greeks did not comply, they would seize a Greek princess in return. Helen had never loved Menelaus, so when Paris came to Sparta, she fell in love with him, as Aphrodite had promised. She agreed to run off with them, so the Trojans returned with a Greek princess as planned. But Menelaus was furious. He knew she had left willingly and that his own men had started the trouble by kidnapping Hesione, but he could not accept the insult, so he asked his brother Agamemnon and Helen's former suitors to help get her back. Many of them didn't want to go to war, but they promised to support Helen's husband. One, Odysseus, pretended to be mad when Menelaus' men came to fetch him. He started ploughing the beach, but they placed his baby son, Telemachus, in his path, and Odysseus swerved, proving he was slain. At last 1,000 ships were prepared and armed to go to war against Troy. The Trojans were willing to go to war for Helen because she had charmed them all. Only Cassandra, Paris' sister, predicted disaster. She could see the future, but it displeased Apollo, who cursed her never to be believed. So the Greek fleet was held up for a lack of wind, because Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. The wind changed at last, and they sailed to Troy. The Trojans would not return to Helen, so the war, which was Eris' spiteful revenge, began. This is, of course, where the famous event, including the Trojan war horse, happened. But many heroes were killed on both sides. The great Trojan hero was Aeneas, Aphrodite's son, by Anchises. He was wounded by Diomedes, and Aphrodite rushed to help him. Diomedes stopped her and even dared graze her with his spear, and in the end Apollo carried him to Leto and Artemis, who healed him. Achilles was the most famous Greek warrior, the son of one of the 7 sons of Theseus and Peleus. She made 6 of her sons immortal by burning away their mortal hearth, and she was doing the same for the baby Achilles. When Peleus came in, he thought she was hurting the child and prevented her finishing. So Achilles was left with one vulnerable place on his body, which he could be faintly wounded, the heel, by which Theseus held him, the Achilles heel. He was given the choice of a long, undistinguished life or a short but glorious one, and chose the second. And as time went on, the warriors began to quarrel. Achilles argued with Agamemnon over a slave girl and left the battle sulking. The Greeks lost heart and were driven back by the Trojan hero Hector, Priam's son. And in desperation, Patroclus put on Achilles' armour and led an attack. He wasn't as skilled as Achilles, though, and the Trojans saw through his disguise and Hector killed him. Achilles was stricken with guilt and sorrow and plunged back into battle. He killed Hector and dragged his body around the city behind his chariot before letting the Trojans buy it back for burial. Paris emerged to avenge Hector's death and shot Achilles in the heel, his only weak spot, and killed him. Ajax and Odysseus disputed who should inherit Achilles' armour, as they both had guarded his body during the battle. Agamemnon decided Odysseus should have it, and Ajax killed himself in shame. To prevent more trouble, Odysseus gave the armour to Achilles' son Neoptolemus. When many of their heroes dead, the Greeks were told the only famous archer Philoctetes could save them. Philoctetes brings new hope. He was bitten by a snake on his way there, and his wound wasn't fatal but wouldn't heal, so the Greeks left him behind and felt very bitter about this treatment. So when the Greeks came back to ask for help, beg for help, he refused. Then Heracles came to him in a dream, saying that if he forgave the Greeks and went to Troy, his wound would heal. He returned and killed Paris with a skillful shot, which gave the Greeks new hope. At once the snake bite began to heal, as Heracles had promised. And then Troy finally fell, thanks to a trick thought up by Odysseus. They pretended to give up and leave her behind a huge wooden horse as a gift to Athene, so she would grant them a safe trip home. They left it out in front of Troy and left. The Trojans were overjoyed, brought the horse into their city, and at night they celebrated. The Greeks who had hidden inside the hollow horse slipped out with a trapdoor, opened the city gates to let in the Greek army, who had snuck back in under the cover of darkness. They ransacked Troy, and vast numbers of Trojans were killed. Helen was captured and taken to Menelaus, who intended to punish her, but despite all the bloodshed she'd caused, still found he loved her and took her back as his wife. And after this war, Paris had caused the destruction of Troy, as predicted, and the surviving Greeks went home, but their adventures didn't end after that. Aeneas was one of the few Trojan nobles who survived and escaped from Troy with a sacred statue called the Palladium. It was a gift from Athene, and it was said that wherever it stood would be the centre of a great empire. He eventually settled in Italy, and his descendants were supposed to have been present at the founding of Rome and to have placed the Palladium in a Roman temple. Rome did become the capital of an empire, and Julius Caesar claimed descent from Aeneas and his mother Venus. Agamemnon came back, and the fates of Agamemnon and his son Orestes illustrate the geek's belief in retribution, by which you reap the rewards or punishments of your own behaviour or of your ancestors. Because after the war, Agamemnon went home to Mycenae, where his wife Clytemnestra was waiting for him. She hated him, and he had killed her first husband and married her by force. He sacrificed their daughter for a favourable wind to go to war, and then stayed away fighting for 10 years. So she plotted her revenge with Agamemnon's cousin, Aegisthus, who always wanted to be king himself. Agamemnon brought Cassandra home with him as a slave, but she'd already given birth to his twin sons when Clytemnestra saw that she was even more determined to punish her husband. She offered the weary Agamemnon a hot bath, and he accepted, paying no attention to Cassandra's warnings of danger, which as usual were not believed. When he had taken off his clothes and armour, he was defenceless. She stabbed him to death, killed Cassandra and her twins too, and married Aegisthus. They ruled as king and queen and seemed to have got away with their crimes. Clytemnestra and Agamemnon had children other than Iphigenia. Their son Orestes was being brought up at his grandparents' home, so he didn't witness the murder of the father, but their daughter Electra wasn't so lucky. She had to live with the murderers and her new husband and watch them do well. But when he grew older, Orestes received a command from the Delphic oracle to avenge his father's death. He was horrified, but went home with his cousin Pallades to find out what was going on. Electra soon convinced him that their mother was guilty and should be punished. Spurred on by her hatred, Orestes killed Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. Thus their evil deeds were punished. However, killing your mother, no matter what she'd done, was the worst possible crime, so the avenging Furies soon came hunting Orestes and drove him mad with grief and remorse. It was no excuse that Apollo himself had ordered the murder through his oracle. Orestes was driven to wandering through Greece. In Sparta he tried to kill Helen, as she had caused so much misery, but Zeus came down, wrapped her in a cloud, and took her to Olympus to be a goddess. And in Athens, Orestes begged to be put on trial. Athene was the judge, and Apollo himself appeared to defend Orestes. Athene decided Orestes had suffered enough and ordered the Furies to leave him alone. 3 of them did so, but the rest continued to pursue him. The oracle next told Orestes to sail to the land of the Taurians and bring back a statue of Artemis they had. The Taurians were barbarians who sacrificed strangers, but Orestes and Pallades set off anyway. They were captured and prepared for sacrifice, but when the priestess came to kill them, it was Iphigenia. She'd been brought there by Artemis when she was saved from death. She recognized her brother and helped him, and Pallades escaped with the statue. And at last he'd made amends for his crime. The curse on his family was lifted, and he was left in peace. Iphigenia continued as a priestess of Artemis, and Pallades married Electra, and Orestes married Hermione, daughter of Helen and course, the famous adventures of Odysseus, who lived on the island of Ithaca, now Santorini, with his wife Penelope and son Telemachus. He had warned that if he went to Troy, he would not return for 20 years, so he tried to avoid going. So Odysseus fought at Troy for 10 years. It was his idea for the wooden horse that ended the war. His journey was full of mishaps, which were recounted in Homer's poem, the Odyssey. First, his ship was separated from the rest of the storm, and it was washed up in the land of the lotus eaters in Libya. Eating lotus fruit made you forget everything except the desire to eat more fruit, so some sailors succumbed and had to be dragged back to the ship. They called it the island of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, who shut them in a cave with his sheep and began to eat them one by one. The sheep went out to graze each morning, but the giant never let a man slip out too. But eventually Odysseus found a stick and used it to blind Polyphemus while he slept. When the sheep went out the next morning, the men clung to their bellies, and the blind Cyclops felt each sheep to make sure no one escaped on their backs, but didn't think to feel underneath. When he discovered the trick, Polyphemus asked Poseidon to avenge him. Not long after, the crew were entertained by Aeolus, guardian of the winds. He tied the storm winds in a bag and gave them to Odysseus to keep. His foolish men thought the bag contained treasure and opened it, releasing a tempest. They were driven into a home of Circe, a witch. She turned unwanted visitors into pigs, and this was the fate of the first men sent for help by Odysseus. Hermes gave Odysseus a flower that made him immune to Circe's spells, and he demanded the release of his men. She was impressed by his boldness and fell in love with him, and restored his men, and then stayed with her for a while. She had 3 sons with Odysseus, though he remained keen to go home. Circe sent him to the underworld to consult Theseus about his future. The seer warned him that when he got home he would find men fighting over his goods. Then finally left Aea, sailing safely past the sirens by blocking their ears with wax, except for Odysseus, who wanted to hear their voices. He had himself tied to the mast so he could not be lured to them. Still, the dangers were not over. They had to negotiate a narrow channel between 2 monsters, as it was impossible to avoid. One was the Scylla, who had 6 heads and snapping dogs at her waist. The other was the whirlpool, Charybdis, which sucked ships to their doom. Odysseus chose to pass near the Scylla and just got by, though she killed some of his men. And on Sicily, the sailors killed and ate some of the cattle of the Titan Hyperion. Theseus had warned Odysseus not to harm these sacred animals, and the angry gods sank his ship, drowning all the men. Odysseus survived by clinging to the mast. He was washed up on the island of Ortygia, where Theseus' daughter Calypso ruled. She stopped Odysseus leaving for 7 years until Zeus sent Hermes to make him let him go, and at last he reached the source of Ithaca. He entered his court disguised as an old man. He found things as Theseus had predicted. The nobles were squandering his wealth and trying to make Penelope remarry. She knew that if Odysseus was dead, it would be wise to accept one of them, but she delayed choosing, claiming she must finish her weaving first. She wove all day, then undid her work at night. This ruse was eventually discovered, and she was forced to complete the cloth. Odysseus revealed his true identity to his son Telemachus, and they secretly removed all the nobles' weapons from the hall. Penelope said she would marry the man who could string the bow Odysseus had left behind and shoot an arrow. She was sure no one could do it. The suitors tried but failed. Odysseus then came forward. They laughed at the older man, but he easily strung the bow and shot an arrow. Realizing who he must be, they reached for their weapons, only to find they were gone. Odysseus had no pity and killed them all. Odysseus settled down again with his family, but one day a strange ship arrived. Odysseus attacked, thinking they were raiders. He was killed in the fight, and only afterwards it was discussed that the strangers were led by his own son, one of Circe's children. Then we have, of course, all sorts of other heroes to look at, but I think that will bring us to the end of this lovely journey through Greek myths and legends. We've got so much information here, so I really do recommend this book if you are interested in, well, just as the book's blurb says, the book is a thrilling introduction to the characters and adventures made up in Greek myths, but can be used in particular as a source of inspiration for role-playing games. So you've got a huge amount of information there if you are looking to base anything that you are doing off Greek myths and legends. Thank you for joining me for this second part of Greek myths and legends. I look forward to having you join me next time